Why German Panzer crews couldn't hit the M18 Hellcat. Part 1. The Speed of the Ghost. In the summer of 1944, a German Panther tank commander sat inside his heavy 5-ton turret, scanning the horizon near the French town of Nancy. He was confident. His front armor was nearly 4 inches thick. His 75mm gun could kill any Allied tank from a mile away. Suddenly, a blur of olive-drab steel flashed across his vision. It wasn't a tank, it was moving too fast. It was a low-slung, open-topped machine that looked like a sports car with a cannon bolted to the top. Before the German commander could even shout an order, the machine disappeared behind a stone wall. He ordered his gunner to traverse right. The heavy German turret began its slow hydraulic groan, turning at just 6 degrees per second. But by the time the gun was aimed at the wall, the American machine had already reappeared 300 yards to his left. One shot from a 76mm gun rang out. The Panther's thin side armor was punched through like wet cardboard. Within seconds, the American machine was gone, leaving only a cloud of dust and a burning German wreck. This was the M18 Hellcat. And for the German Panzer crews, it was the most frustrating, terrifying, and unhittable enemy they would ever face. The right engine scream. The secret to why the Germans couldn't hit the Hellcat starts with what was under the hood. Most tanks of the era used heavy diesel or low-performance gasoline engines. The Hellcat used a Wright R975 radial aircraft engine. It was the same engine used in planes. It produced 400 horsepower in a vehicle that weighed less than 20 tons. For comparison, a German Tiger tank weighed nearly 60 tons. The Hellcat wasn't just fast for a tank. It was fast, period. It could reach a top speed of 60 miles per hour on paved roads. Even in the mud and dirt of the European countryside, it could maintain 40 miles per hour. While the German tanks were lumbering giants, the Hellcat was a predatory shark, moving 3 times faster than anything the Germans were trained to lead with their sights. The turret traverse trap. German gunnery was based on a specific set of physics. They were trained to lead a target firing where the tank would be in 3 seconds. But their heavy turrets were their undoing. A German Panther or Tiger had a turret that turned slowly. If a Hellcat was driving past a Panther at 50 miles per hour at a range of 500 yards, the Hellcat was actually moving faster than the German turret could spin. The German gunner would be frantically cranking his hand wheels, watching the Hellcat literally outrun the barrel of his gun. It was a mechanical nightmare. The Hellcat would circle the German tank, staying in the blind spot behind the turret until it found a perfect opening for a kill shot. The philosophy of don't get hit. The Americans had a very specific and very dangerous philosophy for the Hellcat. Armor is a crutch. The M18 Hellcat had armor that was less than 1 inch thick. A heavy machine gun could almost penetrate it. But the American Tank Destroyer Command didn't care. Their motto was seek, strike, and destroy. They taught their crews that the best way to survive a tank battle wasn't to have thick steel. It was to never be where the enemy was aiming. The Hellcat was built to be a glass cannon. It carried a powerful 76mm gun that could kill almost any German tank, but it relied entirely on its driver's foot and its commander's eyes to stay alive. To the German tankers who believed in the steel wall of the Panzer, the Hellcat was a cheater. It wouldn't stand and fight. It wouldn't trade shots. It would strike, disappear, and strike again from a completely different direction. The master of the ambush because the Hellcat was so light and fast, it could reach positions the Germans thought were impossible. They could climb steep hills, cross narrow bridges, and hide in small patches of woods that a Panther could never fit into. German convoys would often be ambushed by Hellcats that fired 3 rounds and vanished before the Germans could even shift into gear. By the time the German 78s or 88s were in position to fire back, the Ghosts were already 2 miles away, repositioning for the next strike. The M18 Hellcat had the highest kill-to-loss ratio of any American tank or tank destroyer in the entire war. It proved that in the hands of a skilled crew, speed was the ultimate armor. The final word on part 1. The Germans didn't just fail to hit the Hellcat because they were bad shots. They failed because the Hellcat changed the math of the battlefield. It was a vehicle that refused to play by the rules of 1944. As we continue this series, we will look at the specific tactics, the shoot and scoot, and the legendary battles where the Hellcat turned the German blitzkrieg into a panicked retreat. Part 2. Shoot and Scoot, September 1944. The rolling hills of the Lorraine region in France were covered in a thick, gray fog. Somewhere in that mist, the German 5th Panzer Army was moving. Their mission, a massive counterattack to stop the American advance. They brought the best steel the Third Reich had to offer, the Panther tank. Inside a Panther, a German commander struggled to see through his optics. He felt safe behind his sloped armor. But suddenly, the fog shattered. 500 yards away, a shape emerged at 40 miles per hour. It didn't stop. It didn't wait. It fired a 76mm shell while drifting sideways, the muzzle flash lighting up the fog like a lightning bolt. Before the German crew could even scream Panzermarsch, the American machine had reversed at 20 miles per hour and vanished back into the gray void. This wasn't luck. This was the shoot and scoot. This was the lethal ballet of the M18 Hellcat. The philosophy of the blur. To understand why the Germans were so frustrated, you have to understand American tank destroyer doctrine. While the German tanks were designed to hold ground, the Hellcat was designed to never stay in one place for more than 5 seconds. The American crews were trained in a radical new way. They were told, if you stay still, you die. If you trade shots, you die. If you blink, you die. They used their speed not just to travel, but as a defensive shield. In a Hellcat, your armor wasn't the steel on your hull. Your armor was the distance you could put between yourself and the enemy in the time it took them to reload. A German loader needed about 8 seconds to prepare another round. In those 8 seconds, a Hellcat at full throttle could move over 100 yards. By the time the German gunner had a second shot ready, his target was no longer in his sights. It was behind a house, in a ditch, or flanking him from the rear. The Battle of Aricourt, the ultimate proof, the greatest demonstration of this tactic happened at the Battle of Aricourt. The German Panthers outnumbered the American Hellcats and Shermans, and on paper, the Panthers should have won. They had better armor and longer range guns. But the Hellcats of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion turned the battlefield into a slaughterhouse. Using the fog as cover, the Hellcats would sprint into range, fire a high-velocity shell into the thin side armor of a Panther, and then scoot away before the Germans could find the source of the fire. In one legendary engagement, a single platoon of Hellcats destroyed 15 German tanks in just a few minutes, losing only one of their own. The German survivors were terrified. They reported being attacked by invisible phantoms that moved so fast they seemed to be everywhere at once. The Panther, for all its power, was too slow to catch a ghost. The mechanical secret, the torsion bar. How could a tank move that fast and still hit anything? The secret was the suspension. The M18 Hellcat was the first American armored vehicle to feature a high-tech torsion bar suspension system. Each road wheel could move independently with a huge range of travel. This meant that while a German Tiger would bounce and rock violently over uneven ground, the Hellcat stayed level. It was the difference between a farm tractor and a modern trophy truck. This smooth ride allowed the American gunner to keep his sights on the target, even while the driver was floorboarding the engine over a plowed field. The Hellcat could fire on the move with a level of accuracy that the Germans simply could not match. The Germans had to stop to fire accurately. The Hellcat never had to stop. The weight advantage. The math of the Hellcat was simple. Less weight equals more survival. By stripping away the heavy armor plates, American engineers gave the Hellcat a power-to-weight ratio of over 20 horsepower per ton. To put that in perspective, a German Tiger had only about 12 horsepower per ton. The Hellcat had the acceleration of a Predator. It could go from a dead stop to 30 miles per hour in seconds. In the tight streets of European villages, this was a death sentence for the Germans. A Hellcat could pop out from behind a bakery, fire, and be back behind a church before the German turret had even finished turning 10 degrees. It was a game of cat and mouse, but in this version, the mouse had a 76mm cannon and a jet engine. The Predator's mindset, the men who crewed the Hellcat, were a special breed. They were the daredevils of the US Army. They thrived on the adrenaline of high-speed combat. They didn't see themselves as tankers. They saw themselves as hunters. They would intentionally draw fire, acting as bait, only to accelerate away at 60 miles per hour, leading the heavy German tanks into a prearranged ambush where other Hellcats were waiting. The Germans weren't just fighting a machine. They were fighting a mindset that they didn't understand. The Prussian military tradition emphasized stand and fight. The American Hellcat tradition emphasized run and kill. By the time the Germans realized they were in a race they couldn't win, the Hellcat was already gone, looking for its next victim. The speed was the story, but the scooping was the victory. Part 3. The Eyes of the Predator. In the world of tank combat, there is one golden rule. The side that sees the enemy first wins the battle. For the crew of a German Panther or Tiger, the world was a very small place. To protect themselves from shrapnel and small arms fire, the Germans were encased in inches of heavy steel. The commander, the gunner, and the driver saw the battlefield through tiny, thick glass blocks called periscopes. It was like trying to win a knife fight while looking through a straw. But the M18 Hellcat was different. When a German Panzer commander looked through his optics, he often saw nothing but shadows and trees. But when an American Hellcat commander stood up in his open-top turret, he had a 360-degree, unobstructed view of the entire horizon. He wasn't just a tanker. He was a hawk on tracks. And in the high-speed game of hunter versus prey, the open turret of the Hellcat was the ultimate unfair advantage that let the Americans strike before the Germans even knew the game had started. The sight advantage. Binoculars versus periscopes. The German Panzer crews called their tanks steel coffins for a reason. When the hatches were closed for battle, the commander had massive blind spots. He couldn't see what was happening to his left, his right, or behind him without manually rotating his heavy turret or turning his head in a cramped space. The Hellcat commander, however, had absolute vision. He could stand chest-high out of the turret, using high-powered binoculars to spot the glint of a German gun barrel or the puff of exhaust smoke from a mile away. Because he could see everything, he could direct his driver to move the Hellcat into a flanking position while the German tank was still looking for him. The Hellcat didn't just outrun the German turret, it outsaw it. The Germans couldn't hit what they couldn't find, and by the time they spotted the Hellcat, the 76mm shell was already on its way. The sound of the enemy. There was another, hidden advantage to the open turret. Sound. A tank is a loud, vibrating environment. Inside a buttoned-up German Tiger, the roar of the Maybach engine and the clatter of the tracks were deafening. The German crew was essentially deaf to the outside world. But the Hellcat crews, with their open-top design, could actually hear the battlefield. Veterans reported that they could hear the heavy clank-clank-clank of German steel tracks, or the high-pitched whine of a Panther's transmission from hundreds of yards away, even over their own engine. They could hear where the enemy was before they could see them. This acoustic awareness allowed Hellcat crews to set up ambushes in the thick forests of the Ardennes, or the narrow streets of French villages. They would sit in total silence, wait for the sound of a German tank to get close, and then spring the trap with lethal precision. The speed of the fire mission. Inside a traditional tank, the air is thick with cordite smoke, heat, and the smell of grease. When a tank fires, the turret fills with toxic fumes that make the crew sluggish and cloud their vision. The Hellcat's open turret acted like a giant chimney. The smoke from the 76mm gun cleared instantly, giving the gunner a crystal clear view of his shot. He could see exactly where his shell hit or missed, and adjust for a second shot in a fraction of a second. Furthermore, communication was instant. In the heat of battle, an American commander could simply shout an order or use hand signals to his driver or loader. There was no need to rely entirely on an intercom system that might break down under the stress of combat. This human connection made the Hellcat crew act like a single lightning-fast organism. The counterintuitive survival on paper, the open turret seemed like a death trap. It left the crew vulnerable to snipers, hand grenades, and mortar fire. But the statistics tell a different story. The Hellcat had the lowest casualty rate of any American armored vehicle. Why? Because the situational awareness provided by the open top meant that Hellcats were almost never ambushed. They saw the sniper before he fired. They spotted the mortar team before they set up. And most importantly, they saw the German 88 anti-tank gun before it could take a shot. The Hellcat crews traded the illusion of armor for the reality of awareness. They chose to be exposed so that they could be effective. The ghost in the garden, this awareness turned the Hellcat into a ghost that haunted the German Panzers. The Germans began to feel like the Americans were reading their minds. Every time a Panther tried to maneuver, a Hellcat was already there, waiting in the one spot the German commander couldn't see. The open turret didn't make the Hellcat easy to hit, it made the Hellcat the one doing the hitting. It allowed the Americans to play a game of high-speed hide-and-seek, where the seeker was a 30-ton machine moving at 60 miles per hour. To hit a Hellcat, you had to see it. To see a Hellcat, you had to be faster than its commander's eyes. And in 1944, no one was faster than a redleg in an M18. The eyes were the armor. And the vision was the victory. Part 4. The 76mm Sting. In the winter of 1944, the German army believed in the myth of invincibility. They had the Tiger, they had the Panther. To the average German tanker, the American 75mm guns found on standard tanks were like throwing pebbles at a brick wall. They would laugh as American shells bounced harmlessly off their front plates. But then came the M18 Hellcat, and the laughter stopped. The Hellcat didn't carry the standard short gun. It was armed with the M1 76mm high-velocity cannon. It was a long, slender weapon designed for one thing: punching holes through thick German steel. The Germans couldn't hit the Hellcat because it was too fast, but the Hellcat could hit the Germans, and when it didn't just leave a dent. It delivered a sting that could turn the most powerful tank in the world into a flaming iron tomb in a single heartbeat. The sniper's velocity, the secret to the 76mm gun, wasn't its size, it was its speed. The shell left the barrel at over 2,600 feet per second. In the world of tank gunnery, speed equals accuracy and penetration. Because the shell traveled so fast, it had a very flat trajectory. This meant the American gunner didn't have to guess the distance as much as the Germans did. He could simply point the crosshairs at a target and fire. To a German crew, this was terrifying. They were used to American tanks having to get close to be dangerous. But the Hellcat could sit 1,000 yards away, hidden in a tree line, and put a shell through a German vision slit on the first shot. The Sting was as accurate as a sniper's rifle, but it carried the power of a sledgehammer. The silver bullet, a WW2. By 1945, the Americans introduced a secret weapon for the 76mm gun, the high-velocity armor-piercing shell, or WW2. This wasn't a normal explosive shell. It was a tungsten core wrapped in a lightweight aluminum jacket. When it hit a German tank, the aluminum would peel away, and the incredibly hard, heavy tungsten core would concentrate all the energy of the shot into a tiny point. It was like a needle made of diamond. The WW2 shell could penetrate over 5 inches of solid steel at 1,000 yards. This meant that for the first time, a light American vehicle could look a Tiger tank in the face and win. The Germans, who relied on their invincible armor to win the psychological war, were suddenly facing a ghost that could kill them from the front. The myth of the Tiger was shattered by the silver bullet of the Hellcat. Flanking, the geometry of death even without the silver bullet, The Hellcat used its gun in a way the Germans hated, flanking. A German Panther had nearly 4 inches of armor on the front, but only about 1.5 inches on the side. The Hellcat knew this. Because it was the fastest thing on the battlefield, the Hellcat never wanted to fight a fair fight from the front. A Hellcat commander would use his speed to race around the side of a German column. While the Germans were still trying to turn their heavy turrets, the Hellcat was already at their 6 o'clock. At that range, the 76mm gun didn't just penetrate, it devastated. A single shot into the side of a German tank would usually hit the ammunition racks or the fuel tanks. The result was a catastrophic kill, a massive internal explosion that blew the turret off the German tank before they could even fire a single return shot. The rapid-fire response. There was one more reason the German crews were overwhelmed: the rate of fire. A German Tiger had a massive heavy shell that was difficult for the loader to handle in a cramped turret. They could fire maybe 5 to 6 rounds a minute, but the Hellcat's 76mm shells were smaller and easier to handle. A well-trained American loader could slam a new round into the breech every 4 seconds. If a Hellcat missed its first shot, it didn't matter. By the time the German crew had identified where the shot came from, the Hellcat had already fired a second and third round. It was a typhoon of steel that gave the Germans no time to recover, no time to aim, and no time to breathe. The final verdict of the 76th, the M18 Hellcat, proved that a big gun on a fast chassis was more dangerous than a huge gun on a slow one. It turned the heavy tank concept on its head. The Germans couldn't hit the Hellcat because they were too busy dying. They were being outranged, outmaneuvered, and outshot by a machine they had initially dismissed as a toy. The 76mm gun was the sting that finished the German Panzer divisions. It was the weapon that proved that, in the game of war, it is not how much armor you have, it's how many holes you can put in the other guy as armor before he even sees you. The sting was lethal, and the victory was total. Part 5. The Psychology of Terror. By the winter of 1944, the German army was suffering from a new kind of sickness. The doctors called it combat fatigue, but the tankers had a different name for it. They called it Hellcat panic. For years, the German Panzer crews had been the kings of the battlefield. They believed that as long as they were inside a Tiger or a Panther, they were the hunters. They believed in the frontal wall, the idea that if they kept their thickest armor facing the enemy, they were gods of war. But the M18 Hellcat changed the rules of the game. It didn't fight like a tank. It fought like a ghost. It struck from the shadows, it disappeared before the smoke cleared, and it moved with a speed that felt supernatural. To the German soldier, the Hellcat wasn't just a machine they couldn't hit, it was a nightmare they couldn't escape. The sound of approaching death. Fear often starts with a sound. For the Germans, that sound was the high-pitched mechanical scream of the Hellcat's right radial engine. Most tanks of the era had a low guttural rumble. You could feel a Tiger coming from the vibration in the ground. But the Hellcat sounded like a low-flying aircraft. Because it was so fast, the sound would often arrive after the vehicle had already taken its first shot. German veterans reported hearing that specific engine whine in the distance would cause an immediate sense of paralysis. They knew that somewhere out there, a 76mm gun was already pointed at their thinnest armor. They began to see Hellcats in every shadow. Every rustle of a bush or every gust of wind sounded like an American engine. The Hellcat had moved into their heads, and once it was there, the battle was already lost. The shattering of the fortress myth. The greatest psychological blow to the German tanker was the loss of confidence in armor. A Tiger commander was trained to believe he was invincible. This confidence allowed him to stay calm and aim accurately. But the Hellcat's ability to outflank the Germans destroyed that calm. When a Hellcat appeared at your 7 o'clock, moving at 40 miles per hour, your thick front armor meant nothing. You were suddenly vulnerable. The realization that you were naked from the sides and rear created a state of panic. German gunners began to rush their shots. They would fire wildly at a moving blur, desperate to hit the Hellcat before it disappeared. And in tank warfare, a rushed shot is a missed shot. By making the Germans panic, the Hellcat made itself even harder to hit. The invisibility of the Hellcat was 50% speed and 50% German terror. The Ghost of Ericourt. The stories of the Hellcat's lethality spread through the German ranks like a wildfire. After the Battle of Ericourt, where a small number of Hellcats decimated an entire panzer brigade, the German survivors told stories that sounded like legends. They talked about American tanks that could drive through walls, tanks that could fire accurately while jumping over ditches, and tanks that were faster than the human eye could follow. These stories created a defeatist attitude. German commanders started hesitating. They wouldn't move their panzers into open fields because they were afraid of being circled by the ghosts. This hesitation gave the Americans the initiative. The Hellcat didn't just win the physical battle. It won the decision loop. It forced the Germans to react to it rather than the other way around. The paranoia of the open turret, ironically, the very thing that made the Hellcat look weak, its open turret, added to the German fear. German tankers, trapped in their steel boxes, couldn't understand how the Americans could be so brave. They saw the American commanders standing tall in their turrets, looking them right in the eye as they drove past at 60 miles per hour. This aggression was intimidating. To the German soldier, it felt like the Americans knew something they didn't. It felt like the Americans weren't afraid because they knew they couldn't be caught. This confidence gap was the final nail in the coffin of German morale. The hunters had become the prey, and they knew it. The final verdict on terror, the M18 Hellcat, proved that the ultimate armor isn't made of steel, it's made of uncertainty. By the end of 1944, the German Panzer crews were broken. Not just by the 76mm shells, but by the constant, exhausting pressure of fighting an enemy they couldn't hit. The Hellcat was the psychological wedge that split the German armor doctrine apart. It proved that speed, vision, and aggression could overcome any amount of heavy steel. The Germans couldn't hit the Hellcat because they had already been defeated in their own minds. The ghost was real, and it was coming for them. Part 6. The final verdict. The year is 1945. The fields of France and the forests of Germany are littered with the rusting, blackened hulls of the once proud panzer divisions. Among the wreckage of the giants, the tigers and the panthers, you will find very few American M18 Hellcats. History is written by the survivors, and the Hellcat was the ultimate survivor. It was a machine that defied every rule of traditional tank warfare. It had no heavy armor. It had an open roof. It was built with the engine of an airplane and the soul of a race car. For 2 years, it ran circles around the finest engineering of the Third Reich, proving that in the chaos of battle, the fastest draw always wins the fight. Today, we deliver the final verdict on the Kann-Mio-Hun-Tua Engak, the machine the Germans couldn't hit, and the legend that refuses to die. The math of lethality. When you strip away the stories and the legends, you are left with the cold, hard statistics. And for the M18 Hellcat, those numbers are staggering. The Hellcat ended the war with the highest kill-to-loss ratio of any tank or tank destroyer in the United States Army. For every one Hellcat lost in combat, it took down nearly 2.4 enemy vehicles. In the hands of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, the ratio was even more insane. They were the aces of the armor world. They proved that the Hellcat wasn't just a lucky design. It was a surgical tool. The Germans couldn't hit it because the Hellcat was never a target. It was a predator. It didn't wait to be shot at. It dictated the terms of every engagement, ensuring that by the time the Germans were ready to fire, the battle was already over. The great debate, armor versus agility. For decades after the war, military historians debated the Hellcat's design. Many argued that the lack of armor was a suicide mission for the crews. They pointed to the thin skin that couldn't even stop a heavy machine gun bullet. But the veterans who lived through the steel rain had a different perspective. They argued that heavy armor was a false security. A Tiger tank with 4 inches of steel could still be destroyed by a well-placed shot. The difference was that the Tiger was too slow to avoid that shot. The Hellcat replaced physical armor with temporal armor, the armor of time. By being faster, seeing further, and reacting quicker, the Hellcat crew stayed alive by simply not being there when the shell arrived. The final verdict of World War II was clear. On the modern, fast-moving battlefield, agility is the best defense. The genetic code of modern warfare. Look at the tanks of today, the M18 Abrams or the Leopard 2. While they have heavy armor, their primary philosophy is first look, first kill. They use high-speed computers and powerful engines to dominate the battlefield, just like the Hellcat did in 1944. The Hellcat was the evolutionary leap that moved us away from the era of the Iron Knight and into the era of the Smart Hunter. It paved the way for modern light armored vehicles like the M10 Booker and the Stryker mobile gun system. The spirit of the Redlegs and the tank destroyers lives on in every unit that prizes speed and intelligence over brute force. The Hellcat taught the world that a scalpel, if moved fast enough, can defeat a broadsword every single time. The Ghost returns. The Germans couldn't hit the Hellcat because they were fighting the war of the past. They were looking for a stand-up fight, a duel of strength. The Americans gave them a fight of shadows and speed. The M18 Hellcat remains a favorite of historians and enthusiasts, not because it was the strongest tank, but because it was the most American tank. It was bold, it was fast, it was loud, and it was incredibly effective. It was the Ferrari with a 76mm cannon. As the last veterans of the tank destroyer battalions pass into history, the sound of that Wright radial engine still echoes in the archives of military genius. It is the sound of a machine that refused to be caught. It is the sound of the one boom that signaled the end of the Panzer myth. The verdict is in. The M18 Hellcat wasn't just a tank destroyer. It was the future of war, moving at 60 miles per hour,